In the last decade of the 18th century, though, the order and structure of neoclassicism and the art of the Enlightenment really gives way to chaos. The French Revolution starts in 1789, and while it initially seems on track to be something like an American-style democratic revolution, the French were very much inspired by the Americans who they helped win the Revolutionary War. It pretty quickly goes off the rails and descends into the terror and chaos that we call the Reign of Terror. And that's probably actually the image you have in your mind of the French Revolution, is that of people being lined up at the guillotine. That's actually the Reign of Terror, not strictly speaking the French Revolution. One of the interesting things about visual arts in this period is that in some ways visual arts are very restricted. Publishers were strictly monitored and very cautious about what they printed because they could very easily get in trouble if the political winds changed not in their favor. Similarly, printers and visual artists who appealed to an upper-class audience lost many of their patrons, almost in some cases overnight. But some artists did continue to work during the Revolution and the Reign of Terror. And one of those, surprisingly, is Jacques Louis David. We last saw him as the court painter to Louis XVI, but almost from the beginning of the Revolution, he is one of the artists who's most open about his revolutionary sympathies, and eventually he becomes the court painter of the Revolution. He has several paintings that are famously associated with the Revolution, but probably the best known is this one, The Death of Marat. Marat was a famous revolutionary. Physically, he was not a strong man, but he was a publisher and a writer, somebody that was very influential on public opinion. And the story of his death is quite dramatic. He suffered from a skin condition, which he treated by spending many hours in a bath with herbs and things in it every day. And he was murdered by a young woman named Charlotte Corday, who was from an alternative revolutionary faction who feared that her friends were going to be killed by Marat and his faction. So she actually comes to Marat's house twice. The first time she's turned away by his servants, but the second time she makes such a commotion that Marat himself actually hears her and allows her to be brought into his presence in his bath. She hands him a letter, ostensibly containing information about the revolution, and then pulls out from her bodice a kitchen knife that she'd bought earlier that day and stabs him. She makes very little effort to get away with the crime and is arrested almost immediately, and she herself is executed by guillotine just a few weeks later, bringing the story to a kind of all-around tragic end. But Marat really lives on in our imagination through this painting. Although the French revolutionaries often disclaimed religion, David in this painting borrows significantly from religious paintings, both in the dark background, but also in the position of Marat's body, the head tilted over onto the shoulder and the one dangling arm mimic the pose we often see in images of Jesus being removed from the cross. Similarly, we also see the single stab wound in Marat's chest. This is higher on the body than Jesus' wound typically is depicted, but the way it's depicted, that single stab wound with one trail of blood coming down, is similar to the way Jesus' wounds are often depicted. Also, notice that David can't resist the gore, so if we look closely at the bath water, somehow Marat has bled enough to turn the bathwater bright red, but still has just this single trail of blood coming out of his wound. So that really reinforces this idea that David is intentionally drawing on images of Christ to reinforce the martyrdom that he believes has happened here. Similarly, if we look at the side table and the objects on it, they again are designed to reinforce Marat's martyrdom. The table itself looks like a gravestone with Marat's name and the name of the artist incised into it. And the letter here that's on the edge of the table is a letter from, and you can read all of these letters. You can find translations on the internet. They are in French. But if we get a good reproduction, these letters are all legible. So this letter on the edge of the table is from a woman whose husband has been killed in the Revolution, and she's asking for charity, for money to support herself and her children. On top of that letter, there's a banknote, and while art historians argue about the value of that banknote and the amount of real charity that's happening here, the intention is clearly to make Marat look charitable, like somebody who's giving money to widows and orphans. In his hand is the letter from Charlotte Corday that she uses to gain entrance to the room. And again, we can find a translation of this online, or we can read a version if we read French in a good reproduction. And David changes the text. We know the actual text of the letter, so we see David changing that text slightly, again to reinforce the idea of Marat's martyrdom. What's quite interesting about David himself, though, is the trajectory of his career. So, like we mentioned in the previous video, he's quite famous early in his life. He's a preeminent painter in pre-revolutionary France. He becomes the first painter of the Revolution, but at the time of the rise of Napoleon, in the early decades of the 19th century, he goes back to his former life in many ways. He becomes Napoleon's court painter. And in fact, many of the images that you have in your mind when I say the word Napoleon are most likely paintings by David. He paints more images of Napoleon than any other artist. This particular image shows the coronation of Napoleon, and this painting was really designed to impress upon the viewer the importance and grandeur of this occasion. So although it's called the coronation of Napoleon, Napoleon himself is actually wearing a crown already. We can see it right here. And instead, what's actually happening is his wife, the Empress Josephine, is being crowned. David does make sketches of the actual coronation of Napoleon, but Napoleon actually reaches out, takes the crown off of the cushion, and places it on his own head. And while David makes sketches of that moment, he doesn't include it in the final painting, possibly for reasons of political expedience. We also know that David made other changes to the actual scene. David himself was actually present, and in many ways, the scenery and the people seem to match with the people we know were there. He does include a self-portrait up here in the top balcony, but one of the most notable changes is this figure here. This is Napoleon's mother, who we know through historical sources was not present at his coronation. So ultimately, David's career acts as a good stand-in for us to talk about these last few decades, in the very opening decades of the 19th century. So as we enter the 19th century, we're in the age of Napoleon, and we're really in a much more chaotic and unsettled environment. So while in the 18th century we see a gradual transition from the exuberance and Rubiniste nature of the Rococo to a much more serious, straight-laced, Poussiniste kind of neoclassical and Enlightenment art, as we move into the first decades of the 19th century, we're going to see that pendulum swing back the other way, and art itself is going to become much more emotional, much more expressive, and in many ways, much more chaotic.